Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her back against the rocky outcrop, her heart hammering against her ribs as the massive shadow passed overhead. The shadow wing's wingspan stretched nearly 30 feet, its obsidian scales glinting in the harsh afternoon sun of the Australian outback. These creatures had emerged from the deep caves after the Great Collapse 15 years ago, when mining operations had accidentally breached ancient underground chambers. Now, they ruled the skies above the Red Continent, and humans had learned to fear their razor-sharp talons and venomous bite. Elena's research team had been tracking migration patterns for months, but they'd never been this close to a live specimen. The creature landed with surprising grace on a boulder 50 yards away, its serpentine neck swiveling as it scanned the terrain. Its eyes, an unsettling shade of amber, locked onto Elena's position. She held her breath, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger an attack that would end her life in seconds. But something unexpected happened. The shadow wing tilted its head, studying her with what seemed like curiosity rather than aggression. Elena had spent years observing animal behavior, and she recognized intelligence when she saw it. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her pack and withdrew a piece of dried kangaroo meat, emergency rations that might just save her life. She tossed the meat halfway between them and waited. The creature approached cautiously, its massive claws leaving deep gouges in the sandstone. When it reached the offering, it sniffed carefully before consuming it in one swift motion. Then it did something that would change everything. It looked directly at Elena and made a sound, not the terrifying shriek she'd heard in nightmares, but something softer, almost questioning. Elena's colleague, Dr. James Chen, had argued that these creatures were nothing more than sophisticated predators driven by instinct alone. But as she stared into those amber eyes, she saw something that contradicted every scientific report: awareness, consideration, and perhaps even gratitude. The shadow wing remained motionless for several more minutes before spreading its wings and taking flight, disappearing into the azure sky. That night, as Eleanor documented the encounter in her field journal, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary. The indigenous aboriginals spoke of the Old Ones, creatures that had once shared the land peacefully with humans before retreating underground. Perhaps the Great Collapse hadn't just released ancient predators. Perhaps it had opened a door to reclaiming a lost alliance. Her radio crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. It was Marcus Rodriguez from the Northern Research Station, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "Elena, you need to hear this. We've got reports of shadow wings approaching settlements, but they're not attacking, they're watching, and some of them are bringing food to the humans." Elena closed her journal and stared out at the star-filled sky. Change was coming to the relationship between humans and shadow wings, and she had a feeling she'd just played a crucial role in setting it in motion. 3 months after the first encounter, Elena had established the world's first shadow wing research sanctuary in the heart of the outback. The converted mining facility provided shelter for her growing team of researchers, and more importantly, a neutral ground where humans and shadow wings could interact safely. The initial funding had come from the Global Species Reconciliation Initiative, a program established after similar phenomena began occurring worldwide with other emerged species. Dr. Sarah Winters, a linguist specializing in animal communication, had joined Elena's team after reviewing footage of the shadow wings. "Complex vocalizations. They're not just making noise," Sarah explained during their morning briefing, her tablet displaying intricate sound wave patterns. "There's syntax here, grammatical structure. They're trying to communicate with us." The breakthrough came when Elena noticed that the same shadow wing, she'd named him Magnus due to his impressive size, returned to the sanctuary every few days. He would perch on the designated feeding platform, accept offerings of meat, and engage in what could only be described as conversations with Elena. His vocalizations became more varied and purposeful, while Elena learned to respond with specific gestures and vocal tones. James Chen remained skeptical, documenting every interaction with clinical detachment. "We're anthropomorphizing their behavior," he warned during team meetings. "Just because they're not immediately hostile doesn't mean they're capable of genuine interspecies cooperation." But even James couldn't deny the evidence accumulating in their databases. Shadow wings were demonstrating problem-solving abilities, emotional responses, and most remarkably, individual personalities. The real test came when a severe sandstorm threatened to destroy the sanctuary. Elena and her team had battened down for what weather satellites predicted would be a 3-day siege of winds exceeding 120 kilometers per hour. As the storm approached, Magnus and 2 other shadow wings appeared at the sanctuary's perimeter. Instead of seeking shelter elsewhere, they positioned themselves around the facility's most vulnerable structures. Throughout the storm, the creatures used their massive wings to deflect the worst of the wind and debris, protecting the human settlement at considerable risk to themselves. When one of the shadow wings, a smaller female, Elena, called Luna, was struck by flying debris and injured, the team's veterinarian, Dr. Priya Patel, didn't hesitate to provide medical treatment. Luna's recovery took 2 weeks, during which she remained at the sanctuary, allowing humans to care for her wound and bring her food. Her acceptance of medical treatment represented a level of trust that transcended mere coexistence. She wasn't just tolerating human presence, she was depending on it for survival. As Luna healed, Magnus began bringing other shadow wings to the sanctuary, not for food or shelter, but seemingly to introduce them to the humans. Elena realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in human history. A species was actively choosing to form a partnership with humanity, one individual at a time. The morning that changed everything began like any other at the sanctuary. Elena was reviewing behavioral data when Sarah burst into the laboratory, her face flushed with excitement and disbelief. "Elena, you need to see this immediately. Magnus is back, and he's not alone." Outside, Magnus stood on the feeding platform, with a sight that defied everything the scientific community believed about shadowing behavior. Nestled protectively beneath his wing was a juvenile, a young shadow wing no larger than a house cat, its scales still bearing the silver sheen of infancy. But that wasn't the most extraordinary part. Magnus was vocalizing in the complex patterns they'd learned indicated urgency and need, and his body language suggested he was presenting the juvenile to Elena. Dr. Patel immediately recognized the signs. "The young one is injured," she said, pointing to the way it favored its left wing. "Magnus is asking us to help." The implications were staggering. In the animal kingdom, parents protecting their offspring represented the strongest biological imperative. For Magnus to bring his injured young to humans, rather than keeping it hidden in the safety of the caves, meant their relationship had evolved beyond mere cooperation into something approaching family-level trust. Elena approached slowly, speaking in the soft tones that had become their established communication method. Magnus watched intently as she examined the juvenile from a distance, his massive head moving to track her every movement. When she gestured toward the medical facility, he understood immediately, carefully lifting the young one and following her inside. The next several hours tested the boundaries of interspecies cooperation. The juvenile, Elena named him Cosmos due to the star-like pattern of his silver scales, required surgery to repair a fractured wing bone. Magnus remained in the medical bay throughout the procedure, his presence both protective and supportive. When Cosmos emerged from anesthesia, the first thing he saw was his father's reassuring face, with Elena standing quietly nearby. Word of the medical intervention spread quickly through the global research community. Dr. Chen, despite his skepticism, couldn't argue with the documentation. "We're not just observing animal behavior anymore," he admitted during their evening debrief. "We're participants in an interspecies social structure." The recovery period revealed even more remarkable developments. Cosmos, having never learned to fear humans, bonded with Elena's team as readily as he did with his father. He would curl up near Sarah while she worked on translation algorithms, accept food from Dr. Patel's hands, and even seemed to enjoy the gentle music that Elena played during his physical therapy sessions. But perhaps most significantly, other shadow wings began arriving with their young. Luna brought her twin offspring, both healthy but apparently intended for socialization with humans. An elderly shadow wing, Elena, called Sage, arrived with 3 juveniles of varying ages, treating the sanctuary like a nursery where the young could safely learn about their human neighbors. Elena realized they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of society, one where 2 species were actively choosing to raise their young together, creating a generation that would know cooperation as natural rather than extraordinary. 2 years had passed since Cosmos first arrived at the sanctuary, and the changes were remarkable. The young shadow wing had grown into a magnificent creature nearly half his father's size, his silver scales now deepening to the rich obsidian of maturity. But unlike previous generations of shadow wings who remained aloof from humans, Cosmos moved between both worlds with equal comfort. Elena watched from her office window as Cosmos engaged in what had become a daily ritual, teaching the newest arrivals, both human children and shadow-wing juveniles, how to coexist. The Australian government had recently approved the sanctuary's expansion into a full interspecies community, allowing researchers' families to live on site and creating the world's first integrated settlement. "It's remarkable," Sarah observed, joining Eleanor at the window. Below them, Cosmos was demonstrating flight techniques to a group of young shadow wings while simultaneously using vocalizations that Sarah's translation algorithms had identified as teaching words. Meanwhile, 8-year-old Tommy Chen, Dr. Chen's son, was showing a juvenile shadow wing named Pixel how to use human tools to build a nest structure that combined both species' architectural preferences. The children were the key to everything. Unlike their parents, who had spent years overcoming fear and suspicion, the young ones of both species accepted each other as naturally as breathing. Tommy spoke rudimentary shadowing vocalizations as easily as English, while Pixel had learned to respond to human gestures and even simple English commands. Dr. Chen, once the staunchest skeptic, had become one of the program's strongest advocates. After witnessing his son's relationship with the Shadowwings, "Tommy doesn't see them as other," he explained during a video conference with the Global Species Reconciliation Initiative. "To him, Pixel is just another friend who happens to have wings and scales instead of legs and skin." The transformation wasn't limited to the sanctuary. Reports were flooding in from around the world of similar developments with other emerged species. In the Amazon, the thornback serpents, massive constrictors with armor-like scales, had begun allowing human researchers to tag and study their young. In the North Atlantic, the deep dwellers, whale-sized creatures with bioluminescent communication organs, were actively assisting human marine biologists in ocean research. But it was the arrival of Elder Sage with troubling news that reminded everyone how fragile their new world remained. The ancient Shadowwing, now a regular at the sanctuary, arrived with vocalizations that Sarah's algorithms translated as urgent warnings. Magnus and Luna immediately responded, their own calls taking on tones of concern and preparation. "What are they saying?" Elena asked, watching the adult shadow wings gather in a tight formation around their young. Sarah's face paled as the translation appeared on her screen. Danger coming, skyfire, protection needed for small ones. Elena's blood ran cold. The government's military division had been skeptical of the interspecies cooperation program from the beginning, viewing the emerged creatures as potential threats rather than allies. Despite the sanctuary's success, there were factions that believed the contamination zones, areas where humans and emerged species coexisted, should be eliminated through controlled military operations. As if summoned by her fears, Elena's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her government liaison. Aerial reconnaissance mission approved for your sector. Maintain distance from subjects during flyover scheduled for 800 tomorrow. The Shadowwing's early warning system had just revealed that humanity's old instincts were about to collide with their new reality. Part 5. The choice dawn broke with an ominous tension that both species felt instinctively. The Shadowwings had gathered their young in the sanctuary's central courtyard, their massive forms creating protective circles around juveniles who sensed something was wrong but couldn't understand what. Elena stood among them, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what was coming. The military reconnaissance flight wasn't just a surveillance mission. Eleanor's contacts had confirmed it was a preliminary assessment for what General Morrison called species containment protocols. The success of the sanctuary had paradoxically made it a target. Too many people in positions of power still believed that cooperation with the emerged species represented a threat to human dominance, rather than an opportunity for mutual prosperity. At 7:45 a.m., the first jets appeared on the horizon. Eleanor watched Magnus raise his great head, his amber eyes tracking the approaching aircraft with the same intelligence that had first captivated her years ago. But now she could read the complex emotions in his expression: confusion, concern, and beneath it all, a profound sense of betrayal. "They're not here to hurt you," Elena said aloud, though she wasn't entirely certain of her own words. "This is just fear, the same fear we all had to overcome." Cosmos approached her, his now adult form still carrying the trust he'd learned as an injured juvenile. In the human shadowing pidgin language that had evolved at the sanctuary, he vocalized what Sarah's algorithms translated as, "Skyfire birds bring fear smell. Protect small ones." Elena's throat tightened. Even now, facing potential threat from her own species, Cosmos was asking if he should protect the human children in the courtyard alongside the shadow-winged juveniles. This was what General Morrison and his supporters refused to understand. These creatures had evolved beyond mere survival instincts to embrace genuine care for others, regardless of species. The jets made their first pass, low enough that their sonic boom rattled windows and sent several of the younger shadow wings cowering against their parents. But instead of scattering or preparing for battle, the adult shadow wings did something that would be recorded in history books for generations to come. They spread their wings over both human and shadow wing young alike, creating a unified shield of protection. Tommy Chen, now 10 years old and fluent in 3 human languages, plus basic shadowing communication, stood up in the protective circle. "Why are they scared of us?" he called out to Elena. "We're not doing anything wrong." From the mouths of babes came the question that cut to the heart of everything. Elena activated her emergency broadcast system, knowing that her transmission would be monitored by military command, government officials, and research stations worldwide. "This is Dr. Elena Vasquez at Outback Sanctuary 1, she announced, her voice carrying across radio frequencies and satellite networks. "You are witnessing the future of our species, both of our species. These creatures have chosen to trust us with the most precious thing they possess, their children. They have risked their lives to protect our children. They have shared their knowledge, their resources, and their world with us. The jets circled for another pass, but Elena continued speaking, knowing that every word was being recorded and transmitted globally. General Morrison, I know you're listening. You have a choice to make right now. You can choose the old way, fear, dominance, and the endless cycle of us versus them that has defined human history. Or you can choose to be part of something unprecedented, a future where two intelligent species choose cooperation over conflict. As if responding to her words, Magnus stepped forward and began to vocalize in the most complex patterns Sarah had ever recorded. The translation came through in real time. Sky firebirds carry fear hearts. We offer peace gifts. Our small ones and your small ones grow together. Trust bonds stronger than fear bonds. Choose nest sharing over nest fighting. The jets completed their surveillance run and departed, leaving behind a silence that felt like the whole world holding its breath. Within hours, Elena's broadcast had been viewed by over 1 billion people worldwide. Support messages flooded in from every continent, but more importantly, similar sanctuaries reported that their shadow wings and other emerged species had performed identical protective behaviors when they sensed threat. 3 days later, General Morrison arrived at the sanctuary unannounced. Elena met him at the entrance, flanked by Magnus and Cosmos. The general, a stern man in his 60s, stared up at the massive creatures who regarded him with cautious but non-threatening attention. "Dr. Vasquez," he said finally, "I came here to assess a potential threat to national security. Instead, I find myself wondering if the real threat is our refusal to evolve alongside them." Tommy Chen emerged from the education center, Pixel at his side, chattering in their mixed-language conversation about the geometric patterns they'd been studying. The general watched in amazement as the boy and young Shadow Wing collaborated on solving a complex puzzle, their different perspectives combining to find solutions neither could have reached alone. That evening, General Morrison stood before a gathering of both species, his usual military bearing softened by genuine emotion. "I've spent my career preparing for wars," he said, his words being translated simultaneously into Shadow Wing communication patterns. "But I've never seen anything more strategically valuable than what you've built here. The question isn't whether we can afford to trust them, it's whether we can afford not to." Magnus approached the general, lowering his great head in what had become recognized as a gesture of respect and invitation. When the general, after a moment's hesitation, reached out to touch the creature's scaled forehead, Cosmos made a sound that needed no translation, the pure joy of a young being witnessing the birth of understanding between their parents. Elena looked around the courtyard at children of two species playing together, adults of different evolutionary paths working side by side, and parents of completely different biology united in their desire to build a better world for their young. The deadly creatures who had once inspired fear had become the guardians of hope itself. The future had arrived, and it wore scales alongside skin, flew on wings alongside walking on legs, and spoke in harmony rather than discord.